So, good morning, good evening if you're from Germany, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So today we're going to talk about part 2 of something that's significantly more important than LDL cholesterol, but you still see it on your lipid panel, your cholesterol panel. It's the triglyceride over HDL ratio. We covered some of that last week. We're going to cover more of it this week. It's a very, very big topic. Some folks think it's confusing, and it can be confusing. In fact, a lot of the stuff that we talk about in triglyceride over HDL ratio is, at least in terms of the science and academics, a little bit oversimplified. But why talk about something that's oversimplified? Because it's so important. Again, evidence coming out that it's at least 6-7 times more important than LDL, or quote bad cholesterol. And yes, we've had a couple of folks on our channel talk about the impact. Chuck Smith, for example, talked about losing 50 pounds and then having a heart attack and then finding out, well, his triglyceride over HDL ratio was between 5 and 7. That could have been lethal for him. He's done a lot of work and he now has it below 1. Now, what did he do? And how can we decrease that triglyceride over HDL ratio? Those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Both natural ways of doing it, medications that impact it, foods, lifestyle issues, things that improve the triglyceride over HDL ratio. But before we do, we'll again cover extra content that we have available for you. Part 1 was last week. It's on the it's out on the channel now. You can go back and do the review. Vitamin K2 is a perennially popular topic on our channel. In fact, I spent past couple of days writing a blog on a question that comes up time and time again about vitamin K2. Can you take it with coagulants, with blood thinners, anticoagulants? And the answer, I think it was Marilyn Smith wrote the last version of that question, and she said, can you take it with Plavix and blood thinners? With Plavix, yes. With some blood thinners, maybe not. So here's the thing. That topic becomes very confused. It's a very popular topic because a lot of the people that are on blood thinners also have concern about taking K2. Why is that? Well, K2 is known to decrease calcium in your arteries. Also, the people that have calcium in their arteries are often people that have high risk for blood clots. The people that go on blood thinners are people that might have had a heart attack, #1 cause of death. How many million people per year? I think, is it 2 million? I can't remember. It's a little bit less than 1 million, I think. Anyway, stroke. People that have had a stent, people that have had coronary artery bypass. All of those folks will be taking blood thinners. So is there an interaction between vitamin K2 and blood thinners? Many people would say, no, there's not any. It's very different from vitamin K1. But when you look at the science a little bit deeper, there is a question. But it's only on that one group. Which group is that? The vitamin K antagonists, or VKA. So yes, you do need to take a look. You do need to ask that question, and we'll be giving you some more clarity on that question over the next couple of weeks. How to prevent stroke, exercise and more. That was one of our previous topics. One of our most popular topics over the past few weeks has been, can vitamin D lower COVID-19 risk? Or what is the interaction between vitamin D3 and COVID-19? There's been a lot of information about it. We did more of a literature review, a review of the science, and talked about what does vitamin D do in terms of the immune system, and how does that interact with the current pandemic? So let's go to the next comment. Other content available. Our webinars. You know, one of the things that people tell us is, Doc, you're very expensive. We know that. We continue to work on ways that it's not going to have me seeing patients all day, every day. I can continue to create content, but also something that's going to support the channel so we can get that content out further. The webinars have been very, very popular. The subscriptions are becoming more popular now as well. Those are ways to get just a rifle shot focus into something that meets your budget and something that's not going to totally replace your primary care doc or your cardiologist. That's not really the goal. The goal is to help you find things that you're not likely to get from your doc. One of them, for example, one of the most common things is a proper diagnosis of whether or not you have prediabetes, whether or not you have plaque, whether or not you've got cardiovascular inflammation. You know, the CDC says there are at least 80 million people out there with prediabetes in the US, and only 8 million know about it. It's important because those other 72 million are rotting your arteries, burning the insides of them, setting yourself up for heart attack, stroke, kidney disease, blindness, and dementia, but don't even know it. So again, very important information. And again, continuing that struggle on trying to get that where it's scalable, it can pay for our channel content creation, but it's also something that that's very affordable. If you have any questions about affordable content, affordable ways to find out if you have any of these problems, call 859-721-1414. That's 859-721-1414. The courses are a quick and easy way, very affordable, again, also very scalable in terms of setting up a way where you can find out some of this critical information. In fact, with the investment of 20 to 50 bucks and an hour or two of time, you can know more than the vast majority of doctors know about cardiovascular inflammation, insulin resistance, prediabetes, and plaque. The things that are killing us and disabling us. I already talked about subscriptions. Again, those are becoming more and more popular. If I have one piece of advice from my experience on writing a book, it's be careful if you have to do it with a co-author. Coordinating it between the two is a challenge. The bottom line on the book is what a stress test can't tell you. There are 8 million stress tests being done in the U.S. per year. Even the NIH, the Google snippet will say 1.5 million of those we know before they're even done are going to be wrong. And how is that? Why is that? This book goes into the detail. Hopefully Todd and I can get our act together, get it into the publisher, and get it out to you. For those of you who are interested, thank you for your interest on it. The website is growing. We're watching our uptake on the website, and we're getting about 20 times the interest, the page views, the visits on the channel than we were just a few months ago. So again, a lot of interest. We greatly appreciate that, and we're excited to announce that. The reason for it is we're adding a lot of content. We're starting to make what was available only verbally in YouTube now is becoming available on the website itself. We're also improving the themes and the ability to navigate around. So after Aspen gives us the water ball, we'll get into the content for today. Part 2 of triglyceride over HDL ratio. So last week we talked about triglyceride over HDL ratio. What is it? Why is it important? And today we're going to talk about why it's important, the optimal ratio, ethnicity. You know, you'll hear when people start wading into the triglyceride over HDL ratio, you'll start hearing them quote numbers about, well, for the Latinx community, for the African American community, for the Caucasian community. I'll give you a spoiler on that one. I think that part is way overdone. There's clearly patterns that we see in these different communities, but we'll talk about why I think that's way overdone, again, a little bit later in the content section. Probably the most important part of this, though, is how to naturally lower triglyceride and raise HDL. You know, if you've heard it once, if you listen to this channel, you've heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times. You can't supplement your way out of a lifestyle problem. You can't procedurize, surgerize, stent, bypass your way out of a lifestyle issue. And you can't prescribe your way out of a lifestyle issue. In other words, how can you naturally impact this? And this is the same theme. The natural ways of improving your triglyceride over HDL ratio are the best. What are those? We'll talk about them and how they work. And can lowering carbs improve triglyceride, HDL, remnant cholesterol, and cardiovascular risk? Brief spoiler, the answer is obviously yes. And we'll talk about how. So the triglyceride or HDL ratio is important. It's an important predictor of cardiovascular disease risk and a marker of insulin resistance. That's why when people come to me and they don't have any of the OGTT type tests or insulin resistance tests, even with a test that they usually have, and that is that old cholesterol test, I can start getting some really important information. And again, it's not so much about LDL here. It's about level of insulin resistance. So simply put, the blood triglyceride level over your HDL as measured by a lab test. That's what this ratio is. Excuse me just a minute. Now you go back to some of the older studies, older as in a decade ago. The WISE study stands for Women's Ischemia Syndrome Evaluation, or WISE. 544 women were referred to cardiovascular disease evaluation. The triglyceride over HDL ratio ranged from 0.3 to 18.4. Individuals with lower triglyceride over HDL ratio had lower cardiovascular risk. And again, that was one of the studies that really started to bring this to attention. It was in the American Heart Journal. The typical triglyceride over HDL cut points that you saw then and that you see now, I think are way too high. But we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The recommendations you'll see are less than 2 is ideal and above 4 is too high. I would clearly agree with above 4 is too high. In European measurements, they're talking about less than 0.87 is ideal, or 0.87 millimoles per liter corresponds to milligrams per deciliter in the US. And 1.7 millimoles per liter corresponds to 4 milligrams per deciliter in the US. I have, again, a little bit stricter recommendations for what is optimal. Let's talk a little bit about ethnicity. So this was in a study in the by Willie and Associates, the Northern Manhattan study. Is the race and ethnic differences in the relationship between lipid profile components and risk of myocardial infarction. Again, the Northern Manhattan study. So the triglyceride over HDL ratio appears to vary by ethnicity. Hispanic Americans, 3.9. Non-Hispanic Black, 2.9. Non-Hispanic White, 3.3. Now, so therefore, does ethnicity matter? Should we have a different cut point for different ethnicities? I don't recommend focusing on that. There are several reasons, such as the fact that ethnicities are often mixed and maybe even unknown. You know, I've got some friends that consider themselves a walking rainbow. They've got Hispanic, they've got African American, they've got Caucasian blood, all in the same person. So what is that person's ethnicity? So that's one reason, but there are other reasons as well. The biggest reason is that triglyceride over HDL ratio is an indicator of the health of insulin and glucose metabolism. The lower, the better. We know this is the most important thing that's killing us and disabling us on a regular basis. So let's keep an eye on that ratio. This doesn't even mention that most of the cut points used in research as markers for prediabetes are too high. For example, ratios of 2 and 3 confer risk no matter what your ethnicity happens to be or what mixes of ethnicity you happen to have. If your triglyceride over HDL is 3, you really need to focus on getting it down. And your goal should be 1 or less. The goal should be as low as possible. I recommend that my patients target 1.5 or less, and actually 1 if you can get there. And I've got plenty of patients, Chuck, for example, who I mentioned earlier, Chuck Smith. He had that heart attack and let his Tesla drive him to the hospital. Then he had already lost 50 pounds before he had that heart attack. It was on the low-fat diet. And he checked his triglyceride over HDL, found that it was varying between 5 and 7. That same Chuck now has his triglyceride over HDL ratios routinely below 1. So how did he do that? And how can we do that reliably? First of all, lose weight. Second, eat fewer carbs. Carbs have a big impact here. 3, exercise. Number 4, get dietary and supplemental omega-3s. There are medications that improve the triglyceride over HDL ratio as well. Statins actually do. Sometimes they have not the greatest impact in some of these areas, but most of the time they'll have like a 10 to 20% improvement on triglyceride over HDL. They can lower triglycerides by as much as 50%, but usually reliably 10 to 20%. The major impact of triglycerides, statins on the triglyceride over HDL ratio is its impact on the triglycerides. Other medications that impact that triglyceride over HDL ratio, the fibrates, Lopid, Fibricor, Tricor. Prescription strength niacin and niacin supplements, both can decrease triglycerides, but also increase HDL. Prescription strength omega-3s, icosapent ethyl. You've heard that recently. It's the fish oil on steroids, or Vascepa. Epanova, Lavazza, they're all prescription forms of omega-3s. And again, there's a heck of a lot of supplemental forms of omega-3s, and there's a lot of dietary forms of omega-3s. I get mine from eating salmon. Now, can lowering carbs improve the triglyceride over HDL ratio? And what about RC? And what is RC? Remnant cholesterol. Can lowering carbs improve triglyceride over HDL ratio, the remnant cholesterol, and cardiovascular risk? Well, these studies over on the side and that we list on this, this page would indicate so. And I think that there's a lot more out there than just these studies. The Abbasi study is a human clinical trial using a crossover design. People ate high carbs, 60% of their calories. That was their version of high carbs. For 2 weeks, then low carbs. That 40% was their version of low carbs for 2 weeks. And they had a washout period of 2 weeks in between. The high carb diet doubled triglyceride levels, tripled remnant cholesterol, and lowered HDL by 15%. So as you can see, that was a big impact with just a moderate change in carbs. The Wang study, it was a randomized clinical trial in mice. The Volek study, a meta-analysis. You remember a meta-analysis is where you're looking at multiple studies. It reviewed pre-2005 studies. which had already shown that low-carb diets decrease triglycerides and remnant cholesterol while increasing HDL. The Ebeling study, it's also a human subjects clinical trial. It was done at Harvard. Subjects on a low-carb diet had lower triglyceride and higher HDL. How much are you going to improve that triglyceride over HDL ratio? Researchers also showed that the low-carb diets were less likely to result in weight rebound due to improved energy expenditure and leptin. Now let's go back and think about why and how. Why is there triglyceride in the blood? The most common reason for elevated triglycerides is prediabetes. Triglycerides can also become elevated in several inherited diseases. But again, the vast majority of increased triglycerides that I see are due to prediabetes. How does that happen? So here we go to how. Chronically high insulin stimulates adipokines and hormone-sensitive lipase. Hormone-sensitive lipase. We'll talk about that, what that is in just a second. We covered that some last week, and this is repetition because it's a little bit technical and because a lot of folks on my channel have an interest on this molecular level and how that works. So hormone-sensitive lipase, that tells the body to start breaking up fats into fatty acids. This results in release of too many fatty acids from the fat cells. These excess fatty acids take up space in high-density lipoproteins and low-density lipoproteins. An enzyme called CETP, cholesterol ester transfer protein, facilitates the exchange of cholesterol in large HDL and large LDL with triglycerides. So in other words, what happens is you shrink and decrease your HDL population. Triglyceride enriched HDL and LDL in turn are metabolized by hepatic liver lipase, resulting in loss of that large HDL. And we covered this last week, how you look at a fractionation. This is a fractionation of the HDL and LDL components. And what you should have, this is the HDL component. It should look like a bell curve, normal bell curve. But you have this place over on the right-hand side where a major chunk was taken out. That's because of this last process where VLDLs have a lot of triglycerides in them. They transfer that CETP, cholesterol ester transferase, transfers that triglyceride into the large HDL in exchange for cholesterol. That large HDL then gets metabolized by the liver. So that's why you get that big chunk of HDL taken out. So again, with these high-carb diets, we get increased triglycerides and, as you see, decreased HDL. So we're going to cover, I believe we were going to cover that first video real quick. Was that right, Aspen? the key program, the key content area, into question and answers. The first one was, good morning, Bob Weiss in the North Georgia mountains. John Tocho, John shared. He had a lipid panel on Monday. Triglyceride was 45, HDL was 67. So John's triglyceride over HDL ratio is significantly less than 1. Excellent work. And as you saw, he had a low LDL number as well. John sent us a super chat. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate that. And congratulations on those numbers. Okay. Amer Al-Gayer. Hi from Germany. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, Amer. Bart Robinson. Good morning, everyone. Another great discussion. Thanks, Bart. Glad to have you here. Looking forward to it. My BJJ. And for those of you who don't know what BJJ means, it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Good morning from Temecula, California. Great topic. 1957 Cato. Good morning. My last triglyceride over HDL ratio is 2.34. Thank you for sharing that, 57 Cato. Most folks would say that's a pretty good number. As you saw from the program, I would suggest you continue to work on that and see if you can get it more optimized. David Ivers. Good morning from Salt Lake City. Good morning, David. One True Moose. I don't think I've seen that name yet. Welcome. How much EPA and DHA should one take? Any general recommendations? There, as you see, there's significant, well, you may have seen, I'm guessing, based on your comment, there's significant debate about that. I think a general rule of thumb is to work to get a gram total per day of EPA and DHA, maybe like 2/3 of a gram EPA, 1/3 DHA. Hope that helps, and I'm sure, again, you'll see a lot of debate about that when you start fact-checking that and investigating it. My BJJ says, what does it imply if triglyceride over HDL ratio is very good, less than 1? 52 triglycerides, 60 HDL, A1C is 4.9%, but OGTT shows 170 after 1 hour. I assume I have IR from OGTT, but wouldn't elevated triglyceride and low HDL be expected? That is a fantastic question, BJJ, and I see that all the time. And here's what's happening. You obviously are managing your natural ways of decreasing your triglyceride over HDL ratio. You're evidently doing very well with your carbs, you're managing your exercise, and you may be taking some prescriptions that help in that space as well. But the bottom line is you still have insulin resistance. So what happens is when you do challenge your body, your metabolism, by taking that 75 grams or 100 grams of glucose for that OGTT, oral glucose tolerance test, you're still demonstrating that your cell membranes, mostly your muscle cell membranes, but also your liver, are resistant to insulin and don't pull that blood sugar into the cell membranes as well as they should. But again, given your other numbers, your triglyceride over HDL ratio, it's really clear that you're doing a lot of things right to manage this problem. My BJJ, given those numbers, I would guess that the rest of your numbers look pretty good. I would guess that your cardiovascular inflammation panel does not show significant inflammation going on. Now, one of the questions that I get, and it's one of the most common conversations I have as I'm seeing patients, is, okay, doc, I've gotten all that straightened out, but my HDL's not there yet, and my LDL's clearly not there yet. So what do I do? Be patient. HDL and triglycerides both tend to improve significantly and fairly early, within a few weeks to a couple of months, based on improving your lifestyle, and especially dropping carbs, especially diet. LDL can take a while. And unless you lost significant amount of weight, you'll often not change your OGTT. In other words, as I just discussed with BJJ, you still have that insulin resistance, but because you're not continuing to push glucose into your bloodstream, you're not having that challenge associated with those resistant insulin receptors. Great topic. Thank you so much, BJJ, for bringing it up, and thank you for the super chat. Zlatko Herkak. Good night from Melbourne, Australia. Good evening, Zlatko, and thank you for joining us from Melbourne. Bart, I will most certainly purchase 2 copies of your book when it's released, one for myself and one for my doctor as a gift for his retirement. Thank you so much, Bart. I appreciate it. John Tocho, low carb, daily max goal of 20 grams, now and again gets closer to 50 grams. Not so much on the exercise front, which is a goal to improve. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And just as a reminder, John was the one that shared earlier that his triglycerides are 45, HDL 67, LDL 76. So the question is, how did John get there? And that was the answer. It ain't easy, is it, John? Well, maybe it's easy after you make that transition, but transitioning from a standard American diet or a high-carb diet to a daily max goal of 20 grams and sometimes getting up to 50 grams, that takes some work and some discipline. I applaud you for your discipline and what you've done, John. And as you can see, big impact on your numbers. Bill H., Dr. Brewer, my recent triglyceride over HDL equals 1.1. But July ApoB was 136. Thoughts? I'm thinking you'd recommend a CIMT. I would recommend a CIMT, but my first thought on what you described to me is something that I just mentioned a few minutes ago when BJJ was sharing his own numbers. As I said before, as you improve your lifestyle, as you decrease those carbs, the first thing you'll start seeing in terms of this cholesterol panel is that improvement of triglyceride over HDL. Triglycerides will begin to drop. As they drop, you'll quit burning up so much of your HDL, especially that large, fluffy HDL. It takes longer to move that LDL panel, that LDL bell curve over to the right to shift it. That one just takes, for some people, they never get there. For other people, we'll get that early impact on triglycerides. Then we'll start getting that a little bit later, but still early impact on HDL. Some of these people, it'll take months to start seeing that shift to the right of the LDL numbers. Thank you. It was a great question. And yes, CIMT is the only way to tell next year versus the coming year versus previous years or this year, whether you're improving or getting worse. It's also the one image that helps us understand whether or not you've got the specific immediate danger of soft plaque, CIMT. But you got to get it from the right place. The vast majority of CIMTs that people bring into me before getting geared up with our programs are not really that good. It's really hard to get a good standardized CIMT. So there's only like 2, maybe 3 places in the country that I would use CIMTs. But the second one, Cardio Risk, has folks coming all over the country. So you can access it basically anywhere in the US. It just takes a little bit of time and effort to coordinate it. Bill H. Dr. Brewer, I think I just covered that one, didn't I? Also, recent calcium score was 171. Well, that, you've got some calcium. My next question would be, how old are you? And again, clearly, once you start talking to me about a calcium score, my next recommendation is to go to CIMT. What does that tell you? Dave Murphy. Good morning, Dave. How are you? I'm about halfway through Peter Attia's podcast with Tom Dayspring. Very interesting, but really heady stuff. Well, I warned you, and it is. It's deep, but it's a lot of fun. You may have to listen several times to absorb it all. I tell you what, I will have to listen several times before I can absorb all of that as well. There's a lot in there. My BJJ, they recommend eating 150 grams plus of carbs per day for 3 days prior to the OGTT. If we eat low carb and then don't do this, could it give us a false positive OGTT from peripheral insulin resistance? You know, that's a really good question, and I appreciate you bringing that one up too, BJJ. So here's the issue. You really get what you pay for, or you get what you ask for. Now, with most of us, you'll see that we recommend that you do 3 days of carbs before you get the OGTT test. Now, what will that tell you? The biggest impact is going to be on that first phase of insulin response. Insulin response has 2 phases, the first phase and the second. The first phase is actually stored insulin. And the second phase is insulin that your pancreas is making. Now, if you are, I saw 2 people yesterday, for example, that their peak glucose numbers came back 236, 250 something. So by definition, these folks both met the criteria for full-blown diabetes or frank diabetes. And we were having this conversation. One was saying, well, maybe that happened because I've been going very low carb and I didn't eat carbs before the test. No, that's not what happened. He's got insulin resistance to the extent that he's got full-blown diabetes. But what it would have shown would have been if you eat those carbs for a 3-day period prior to getting the OGTT, what that shows is your insulin response and your glucose response if you're in a typical mode of eating standard American diet, not watching your carbs. In other words, in those modes, if you've got insulin resistance, quite often your phase 1 insulin response is missing because insulin is depleted. You're not able to store it. So as usual, I went down a couple of bunny holes and maybe went around the tree a few times, but I hope that gives you the information that you need. So Dave Murphy's sharing with us the Drive, episodes 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25. So yeah, it's about 5 podcasts. Each one's about an hour long. And as Dave and I said, they're pretty deep, but they're also very, very enlightening if you're curious about this topic. To the point, and I'll repeat what Atiyah said, it was funny the way he said it. He said, you know, I never cease to amaze myself with my utter buffoonery around HDL lipidology. And, you know, you think, wow, that's very interesting and neat that somebody, especially at his level, can admit that. What was very interesting was the response he got from Thomas Dayspring. And he said, we're all there. In other words, 2 of the top guys, especially with Dayspring, in lipidology saying, HDL lipidology is very, very difficult. But again, that's for stuff that want to go there. I think what we've presented, the 101 version, is what you need to protect your health. Roscoe Tanner, the screenshots are blurred and unreadable. There were, I hope not all of them were. That's the first I've heard about that on any of the YouTube live events. I know that one, maybe 2 of the slides are a little bit blurred. Those actually came from Dayspring on some of his publicly available lipids, you know, the one with cholesterol ester transferase. Cal Curtis, how much niacin is recommended? Does it depend on body weight? Of course, almost everything depends on body weight, but there's some standards around niacin. What most people say is you never get any significant lipid impact from niacin until you get to 2 grams. So here's 2 or 3 different points around that space. Number one, most people don't even use niacin anymore because of some unfortunate misinterpretations of the science in the past, which we can go into at some point. And I've gone into it. You look it up on my videos, Ford Brewer, YouTube, the great niacin debate. There's still a lot of people that do use niacin. Niacin is really the only thing that increases HDL, decreases LDL, decreases triglycerides. It has a lot of very positive impacts. Now, for the people that do use it, again, they say you got to get up to 2 grams. And here's why they say that. They're typically watching things like LP(a) or some of the other lipids. And by the way, niacin's the only thing that we know of yet that has significant impact on LP(a). Another little bunny trail and comment. We are getting some very, very interesting new information from the new drugs, the new high-tech drugs for LP(a). They're called antisense drugs, and we can talk about those sometime later too. But back to the original question, dosage. Here's the thing. I see plenty of people that get a significant impact on 500 milligrams of niacin per day. Now, there's another reason why I have a slightly different twist on that. I also track cardiovascular inflammation. And one of the things that we tend to see is that people will get up to these lower doses, but still significant, 500 milligrams. And they start getting decrease in their inflammation, often when that inflammation is associated with LP(a). So again, I hope that helps. I do advise patients to try to get between 500 and 2,000 milligrams, or half a gram and 2 grams per day. 1957 keto, triglyceride 109, HDL 47, ratios 2.31. Thank you for sharing, keto. And a lot of folks, as you've seen, would say that's a good number. And as you've also seen, I would say it's certainly not optimum. Keep working on it. My BJJ, I scored 4.9% on A1C, eating less than 100 grams of carbs per day. Also, I try to exercise often, especially post-meal, to lower the area under the curve. High-intensity interval training, HIIT, seems to work best. Perhaps this has also helped triglyceride over HDL. It does. Bill H., is there such a thing as too high HDL that is actually unhealthy? Yep, you do see some HDL numbers. Once over 100, over 90, once they start getting significantly over 80, what you need to start looking for is, it isn't so much that the HDL level is unhealthy, it's that the HDL is not effective at doing what it's supposed to do. And so the underlying cause is not the high HDL. Don't worry about getting your HDL too high. The underlying cause is people who have a genetic problem with their HDL, resulting in an extremely high number. I hope that helps. Dave Murphy, Dr. Dayspring is really annoyed by HDL referred to as good and LDL referred to as bad. He is, and I understand that. And sometimes I still do it, depending on the level of the audience or the person that I'm talking to. As you may notice on these events, the YouTube live events, I don't use those terms very often because, again, the guys that tune in on this channel for these events are pretty much beyond that. He says it's all dependent on what the particle is doing at the time, and he's right. HDL can be bad and LDL can be good at times, again, depending on what's going on. Thank you, Dave. Jim Clark, good morning from Marietta, Georgia. Would you please explain the importance of remnant cholesterol values? Longer in blood system is bad, so the lower the better. I simplified it, but is that acceptable? That's correct. And so Dave Feldman has a good section on remnant cholesterol. There are a couple of other places where if you look up remnant cholesterol, and actually I talked about it in, I think, one of my most recent blogs. I've also got a couple of videos on remnant cholesterol. Here's what it is. It's VLDL and IDL. Now, that doesn't help very much, does it? But let's think back through it and you understand what it is. VLDL is very low density lipoprotein. IDL is intermediate density lipoprotein. In fact, I'm going to go back and share. I think I have an image that will show this. Yep. Don't know if it's going to be big enough. Hopefully we can expand the size here. So these are VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. IDL is intermediate density lipoproteins, then LDL and HDL. Now you see the VLDL are by far the biggest, the IDL are also big. Now, as you mentioned, these don't last in the bloodstream very long. They are very triglyceride-laden particles, tend to come from the gut. Where triglyceride is being absorbed from a meal. So the body works very quickly to try to get those VLDL numbers down and the IDL numbers down. Now, if your triglycerides are really high, and if you have problems with your lipid and insulin metabolism, you don't have as many places to put the triglycerides. As we mentioned before, your insulin resistance is cranking up. It's stimulating your lipase, your hormone-sensitive lipase, and you're getting too much activity, too much push of fatty acids into this transport system. Once you decrease your carbs, you don't get all of those fatty acids being pushed in. And so then you have these large fluffy HDLs and large fluffy LDLs that the cholesterol ester can use to transfer and other mechanisms can use to transfer that triglyceride out of your system. So again, hope I didn't butcher that explanation too much. Bottom line is, yeah, you want to get those triglyceride-laden particles, the VLDL and IDL, out of the system. Now, wait a minute. We thought we were talking about remnant cholesterol. Why did you go to VLDL and IDL? VLDL and IDL are remnant cholesterol. How do you calculate it? Well, you take your HDL and your LDL, you add those together, and you subtract that from your total cholesterol. And the goal numbers, the lower you get, the better. And again, most people will say below 20 is a good number. And yes, you'll see people up in the 40s and 50s, and that's not a good remnant cholesterol number to have. Thank you so much, Jim. Great question. Gave me a great opportunity for another bunny trail. John Anderson, does having stents in your arteries cause inaccurate calcium scores? Score was 483 in July. Score went up to 3910 in June of 2020. I'm not an expert on that specific topic. I will tell you a couple of things, though. Quite often we see a major increase in calcium, and it's associated with having an event, and it's often not a bad thing. And here's why. You know, I had this with a patient, another patient this week. He said, Doc, I had a calcium score of 300. I went on a low-carb diet, and then I went completely carnivore. I lost 50 pounds. My cardiologist told me I was killing myself with my carnivore diet. And I will tell you, this was carnivore with a little bit of dairy in there. Bottom line was, again, he lost 50 pounds by dropping his carbs. And I'm not concerned about it being carnivore. But I think he, my perspective with him was, you're not killing yourself. Dropping those carbs, and especially dropping that poundage, that body fat, it's huge improvement in your life. You're not killing yourself, you're saving yourself. And he said, well, here's the other thing. He said, when I did that and I lost the 50 pounds, my calcium score went from 300 to 1300. And then I began to think, maybe my cardiologist was right. Now, if you did many CIMTs, and if your cardiologist did a whole lot of CIMTs, they would begin to understand a process that you can Google, do a fact check on me, you'll see it time and time again. Again, most docs are not aware of it. The reality is the risk is caused by soft plaque, inflamed plaque. And when you take plaque and you reverse that inflammation, you can shrink the plaque. Your cardiologists often don't believe that. Doctors often don't believe that. Yes, you can. Just look it up on something simple like Harvard Health and you'll see it. And we've got plenty of videos on that. But here's the key point that gets back to your question, John. When you go from soft, inflamed plaque to stabilized plaque, you increase your calcium score. You can increase it dramatically. And that was clearly my point to this individual. No, I don't think you increased your score or your risk, even though you went from 300 to 1300. I see it all the time when people lose 30, 40, 50 pounds. Instead of getting a significant decrease in calcium score, they often get a major increase. And it was because they stabilized all that plaque. Does that mean you can never get a reverse in calcium score? It doesn't mean that. There's a fellow, and I'm blanking on his name. He's the guy in LA, I think, that's done a whole lot of work on calcium scores. He did a couple of articles about reversal of calcium scores. I've got a couple of patients that did videos on reversal of calcium scores. John Lorscheider and Jerry Kurth both demonstrated reversal of calcium score. Well, does that mean they're getting worse? No. With both of these individuals, they were demonstrating significant improvement in lifestyle, 40-pound weight loss in one, 20 or 30-pound weight loss in another, significant improvements in other components of lifestyle as well, like carbs and things like that. So things aren't always as they seem. Thank you, John. It was a great question. Bob Bell, endocrinologist, states IGT and OGT is likely dysfunction of first phase beta cell insulin. First phase dysfunction is one of the first effects of beta cell dysfunction, even though insulin sensitive. So thank you for the comment, Bob. Bob is a senior viewer and does a lot of independent research in this area. And yes, you get into some very interesting components about those phases of reaction. Jonathan Hull, hi, Dr. B. Is the powdered form of natto more easily absorbed than the capsule form? Is that why you take both? I'm wondering about the difference between 400 micrograms in capsule form and a mixture. You know what? That's really a good question. And Jonathan, obviously you've seen a lot of my stuff. Some things I do, and I just don't have the greatest reason. I am obviously a big believer in K2 and vitamin K2. And there are a couple of major sources. Most of them are supplemental, unless you happen to eat a lot of natto. But some cheeses, some meats, some fermented food products. And natto is obviously a fermented bean product. No, there's not I'm not aware of any significant difference between vitamin K2 that you would get in a pill and vitamin K2 that you would get from powdered natto. And I do both. Barry Davis, any difference in your protocol and recommendations with the Bale-Donine method? Yeah, I worked with, Brad was in my office for a couple of years, and I worked with Brad a whole lot. I learned their method from them, and I learned a lot from them. At the end of the day, I think the major differences are that I tend to focus more on root cause, the diabetes issue, um, and less on cardiovascular inflammation. Cardiovascular inflammation is a key component of this, but you tend to see it in far fewer people than you might think. On the other hand, as I've mentioned before, the majority of people 60 and older have prediabetes. 90% of them don't know about it. And that is, as if you've read the book, Beat the Heart Attack Gene, Brad and Amy don't really come out that strongly on it. And I did this. I got curious about it because, again, I said, I like these guys a lot. I just don't hear them talk about insulin resistance that much. Well, I went back and did a search in their book. And sure enough, about 5 times they think about 3/4 of cardiovascular inflammation is caused by insulin resistance. I think that's a little bit low. I'd say more like 80 to 85%. So we're just quibbling over some nitpicks there. But the bottom line is the big issue that's killing us is this unrecognized prediabetes epidemic. And so I go a little bit deeper in terms of chasing that down. Thank you, Barry. It's a great question. Bill H. Screenshots were not blurred at all for me. Thank you, Bill. And if they weren't blurred for you, then evidently they weren't blurred coming out of here. So my BJJ, Peter Attia interview with Dr. Ron Krause is well worth a listen. Krause is credited with discovering lipid particle size and developed the Quest Cardio IQ. Gets deep into LP particle discussion. Thank you so much. Great suggestion, BJJ. Jonathan Hull. Blurry screenshots always happen on my TV, but not my phone. Videos generally blurry, but on my... Okay, well, sorry. Hope we can work through that. Dave Murphy, I've found the blurry screenshots are dependent on the device I'm watching on. I've watched on 2 simultaneously and had one blurry and one clear. So again, I think you've got some experts on this issue. Thank you guys for sharing those details. Dave Murphy, don't forget to do a thumbs up. Thank you so much, Dave. I appreciate that. You do these thumbs up, and there's an algorithm. The second largest search engine in the world, YouTube, has an algorithm which looks for things like this. And when they see that you've done a thumbs up, that tells them humans are watching this, they think it's important, and they'll send it to other humans. And so that's one very easy way that you can help me get this message out about people so they stop letting their arteries burn up. And so we start living to 90 on a regular basis in a healthy fashion, or 120 instead of 60, 65, 70. Bart Robinson, thumbs up. Absolutely, Dave. Thank you, Bart. BJJ, please remember to give the video a thumbs up. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it quite a bit. San Diego Life, 142 I'm guessing that's triglycerides, 47 HDL, needs some work. 119 LDL with no statin due to intolerance, but now 2 weeks into 5 milligrams twice a week. I'm guessing that may be 5 milligrams of rosuvastatin, generic Crestor. Also the DHA EPA, and I will have lipid panel in 2 weeks. Will this do the trick? Well, it'll certainly help. There's no question in my mind it will help. My bigger question is, what's your diet? And then once you get there, what's your diet? What's your exercise? Some of those things. What are the supplements you're taking? Oh, John, thank you so much. Remember to think about joining Patreon. Again, I do appreciate that. Patreon's a way to, again, do your part to help us get this message out there so people will quit dying, having heart attacks, going blind, having dementia. These things are preventable. Forgot to mention lipoprotein A, 2.1. Oh, well, that's a good number. And I think you meant LP little a. Thanks, Dr. Brewer. What are your thoughts on chelation therapy? You know, most of the scientific reviews I've done on chelation therapy just did not show a significant improvement. I know there are a couple of studies out there which indicated a possibility, but you know what? You see one or two studies, and that's called a signal. There are clearly some signals out there in the science about improvement with chelation therapy. But in terms of proof and reliability, haven't seen it. As you can imagine, I get a lot of folks that have come to me that have tried chelation, and I haven't had one yet that said, yeah, it worked great. Barry Davis, what's your opinion on Ted Naiman's PE diet? Not familiar with it. Sorry, Barry. My channel, thumbs up. Thank you so much. BJJ, John Tocho, what was your LP little a elevated prior to this blood work? Higher. Zen Doggy, what significance does alcohol have on triglycerides? Can it raise your risk of plaque inflammation? Out of the biggest items, alcohol can sometimes improve triglycerides. Sometimes it has the opposite effect. It's most well known, ethyl alcohol, for having an improvement of HDL. At the end of the day, you really have to ask the question, is it worth it given the other risks that it brings to the table? And I will say this, I clearly don't think that impact on cardiovascular status and risk or other things is a great excuse for drinking a whole lot of alcohol. Even with that, if you do, you should limit it. Like I said, it's not. It's got other risks associated with it, and the improvements in HDL are not that stellar. Linda Yip from Belgium. Thank you so much for joining us, Linda. Sending a thumbs up since just discovered your channel this past week. Already you've answered so many questions. Well, thank you, Linda. And thumbs up to you. Thumbs up to that comment. We greatly appreciate it. Not 57 Cato. What about serapeptase? Should all of us must use it? Well, I got myself in trouble last week because I made an error. It's a common error, the confusion between nattokinase and serapeptase. In fact, if you Google it, you'll see that Google has a lot of places where they've conflated those as well. Serapeptase is made from, I think it's the saliva of silkworms, and it has some proponents that dissolve protein. So people say, look, protein is the major component of plaque. So if you take serapeptase, you're going to get decreased clotting. Well, when you actually look through the science and the evidence, not so much. It's sort of like the situation with chelation therapy. You see occasional signals, but it's not a reliable issue. And here's what I think. You know, serapeptase is a protein, and I think it's like many other proteins, it's degraded as it goes through the stomach acid. Now, I've made that comment before, and here's the comment that I get back. Well, you doofus, you don't know that serapeptase is given with enteric-coated capsule. Yes, I do know that. I've always known that. Have you ever looked, and my response is always, well, have you ever looked to see how effective enteric-coated capsulization is? In other words, it's not the greatest. So I'm not a big fan of serapeptase. Sorry. The theory's great, but the reality leaves a lot to be desired. San Diego Life, my diet is 1,600 calories a day, 131 grams carbs, 131 protein, and 50 fat. My nutritionist is anti-keto, but after listening here, I think I need to lower carbs. And yes, it was rosuvastatin. San Diego Life, one of the first things you need to do is assess the situation. Do you have a carb metabolism problem? I can tell you already the answer is probably. Over 50% of us, 30 years and older, have a problem there. It's just becoming clearer and clearer. So I think you need to take a look, and we can help you do that. I'll give you, excuse me, my nose is itchy. I'll give you a number you can call if you'd like us to help get there. 859-721-1414. That's 859-721-1414. And yes, I do think that you probably could do better with lower carbs. Another author you may want to think to take a look at is David Ludwig. Dr. Ludwig is the author of Always Hungry, and he has a good section in his book about the impact of carbs on diet and health. He also happens to run the obesity program at Harvard, and he also happens to be an endocrinologist, faculty member at Harvard, and he also happens to be one of the leading researchers in low-carb dieting. He also, one of the things that's my favorite about him is he's not one of these strident, he's not a crusader in terms of diet. He's just very matter of fact. San Diego Life gave us a $5 super chat. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. As you may have noticed, a lot of our assistant staff and technical staff are from the Philippines. $5 super chat may not seem like much to you and your budget in the U.S., but it's a big deal to this channel because it makes a big difference in terms of getting that message out to people and saving lives. Zen Doggy, a 61-year-old friend who was always healthy and active, but always drank, just had triple bypass due to 60 to 70% blockages. And I want to know if his drinking may have contributed to his blockages. It's a possibility, but the biggest issue, again, go back to square one. What was your 61-year-old friend's carb metabolism? It's not at all likely that he had an OGTT, let alone, or an insulin survey, let alone an oral glucose tolerance test. You know, it's like they talk about, there's an adage in medical school. You hear hoofbeats, you don't think zebras, unless you happen to be in Africa, you think horses. Well, so after having heard what you've heard today, insulin resistance, carb metabolism problems are usually the major cause of this problem. Why don't you look there first? Thanks for the question, and thanks for the clarification. Okay, folks, there are 6 thumbs up. 100 watching, should be 100. Thank you, Bob, for checking that out. I appreciate that. And thank you guys for your interest. We've gone on. It's been about an hour, and really got a lot of participation, a lot of focus. Just got another super chat, Jonathan Hull. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Wellness path for me, word on the street is that iron is the root cause of LDL oxidation. Wonder what street you're living on. Iron is an issue, and anyhow, different issue. Thank you so much for your interest. Talk to you next week.